Imagine you are in a video call with your boss when suddenly your chair decides to break. It couldn't possibly get any worse than that, right? Wrong. Imagine you are a captain of a Boeing 737 and this happens to you during takeoff roll in the middle of the night somewhere in India. Today we are going to take a look at the weird case of Air India Express 611 that almost ended in disaster due to a somewhat comical incident. Welcome to Airspace. On October 12, 2018, Air India Express 611 was getting ready for departure at Tiruchirappalli Airport, here in India. That name is quite impossible for Westerners to pronounce correctly. That's why the city is often referred to, even by Indian residents, as Trichy. On that night, the Boeing 737 was to fly a very normal scheduled flight to Dubai. The flight lined up on runway 27, which features a length of about 2,400 meters, or roughly 8,000 feet. On the flight deck, a 32-year-old captain and a 51-year-old first officer were concentrated and ready for departure. After the flight received clearance for takeoff, the 737 accelerated normally, like it would during any other departure. But as the plane hurtled down the runway at 117 knots, the captain's seat back suddenly reclined completely, bringing the captain into an attitude that was entirely too comfortable for this phase of the flight. As the startled captain was flung backwards, he held onto the control column and the thrust levers, pulling both back before he realized what was happening. He immediately let go of both and shouted to the first officer that he should take control. The first officer immediately did as he was told. However, neither the captain nor he initially realized that the thrust levers had been inadvertently pulled back from the required 98% thrust setting to just 71%. While the co-pilot maintained the center line of the runway, the captain attempted to reseat himself. He succeeded after about 5 seconds, assumed control and continued the takeoff. However, he soon noticed that they were rapidly approaching the runway end and sufficient takeoff speed had not been attained. It was, however, already too late to abort the takeoff run. Trying to make the best of a bad situation, the captain started to pull back on the control column to get the 737 airborne. However, the aircraft's reaction was sluggish due to the lack of airspeed. The aircraft went over the runway end, its tail contacting the ground, and then finally, it lifted into the sky. Only then did the captain discover that the thrust setting had been reduced by him. He restored it immediately. But during the 737's cumbersome departure from the ground, flight attendants in the back heard loud thuds, which they thought were due to some pieces of cargo shifting in the hold below. They immediately informed their superior, who in turn soon relayed the information to the captain. Meanwhile, the 737 was climbing into the night sky, when the tower controller of Trichy Airport informed the crew that their climb-out had looked very low and shallow, and asked whether everything was normal. The crew acknowledged and stated that indeed, operations were normal. In the meantime, the supervisor in the tower became suspicious of the situation, since exactly during Air India Express 611's departure, the localizer antenna of runway 27 dropped offline. This array of antennas is used to guide planes to the runway and is located here at the far end of runway 27, exactly under the departure path. A guard stationed nearby was sent to the location. As he was tasked with this, he already replied that he had heard loud bangs as Air India Express 611 departed. When he reached the site, it became clear that something was clearly amiss. Several of the localizer antennas were bent severely out of shape, and behind it, the boundary wall of the airport had some distinct holes in it. There were several pieces of aircraft between the debris of the antennas and the wall as well. An Air India maintenance technician took a look and discovered, among other parts, an entire radio antenna that was sheared off the aircraft. He suspected that the plane had suffered severe structural damage. Just 10 minutes after departure, the flight was informed that it clearly had hit the localizer and the boundary wall of the airport. The crew just acknowledged the transmission and stated that everything was normal on their end. Still, they at least performed system checks of the landing gear, the pressurization system, engines, hydraulics, and so on. Everything seemed to work completely fine, so the crew decided to continue to their destination. But as the flight progressed, more and more people learned of the incident and Air India's operations center was informed. Soon, the chief of operations decided that he would like to see the aircraft return to Mumbai, even though the 737 had almost made its way to Dubai. When the crew learned of this information, according to the cockpit voice recorder, one of their first reactions was, "I hope this does not make the news." Then, the crew evaluated if they even had enough fuel for the return trip to Mumbai. They were puzzled by the instruction to prolong their flight, even though there was suspected structural damage to their aircraft. Still, they heeded the wish of their operations department and set course to Mumbai, seeing that they had just enough fuel for that. Upon arrival there, they requested the long runway and emergency service to be ready on ground, just in case. In the end, the landing was uneventful and the airplane was able to taxi to a stand where everyone on board deplaned normally. When the aircraft was inspected on site, it was found that indeed it had hit the localizer and the boundary wall. The underside of the aircraft was ripped open over a length of several meters. One engine pod was torn open, the tires were damaged, an antenna was ripped off, the flaps received impact damage, and the left horizontal stabilizer had a quite sizable hole in it. From this, it was clear that everyone on board had escaped a disaster just by mere inches. Had the plane lifted off just seconds later, it would have probably hit the wall and the road behind it at full speed, leading to a crash that would most probably have cost dozens of lives. After the incident, the flight crew was thoroughly interviewed and the seat assembly of the captain was examined. It was found that indeed, the back of the seat would no longer lock in place and would move if just little force was applied. According to statements made by the captain of the flight and the previous crew that had used the 737, this had not been a problem before. From what the investigators were able to gather, the mechanism indeed failed at the worst possible time, at high speed during takeoff roll. The actions of the crew were also closely analyzed. Could the first officer or the captain have prevented this accident? Simulator tests were undertaken to answer these questions. 3 possible scenarios were flown. During the first, it was inspected what would have happened if the first officer or the captain had restored full thrust after 5 seconds of the captain's undue departure from his seated position. The result was an almost normal takeoff path that would have even left enough safety margins. In the second scenario, investigators looked at the possibility that the first officer could have aborted the takeoff upon a possible instruction of the captain or out of his own initiative. The test passed, revealing that this would indeed have been possible. The third and final scenario tried to figure out what would have happened if the captain had aborted the takeoff when he returned to a normal seating position. This resulted in a runway overrun. During the tests, it was also discovered that most pilots instinctively held onto the control column and the thrust levers when their seatbacks reclined suddenly, resulting in undue inputs to both controls. In the conclusion of the final report, the team of investigators noted that it was admirable that the crew had performed confidence checks of the aircraft systems to ensure that the aircraft was still airworthy. However, the pilots had been informed of the fact that they had most likely hit several objects on departure, which would have given them ample clues that most likely their aircraft had been structurally damaged. Many systems are unmonitored, and there is simply no warning system to monitor whether a 737 has picked up a piece of plastic mesh that formerly belonged to an airport perimeter wall. Yes, this was the case here. This piece was stuck to the landing gear and was transported all the way from Trichy to Mumbai. Therefore, the board concluded that the crew performance and decision-making was suboptimal. This is further reinforced by the fact that the captain could have just called for the first officer to recheck takeoff when he was suddenly very much indisposed. This was a very strange case indeed, and one would believe that most likely it has to be unique. However, during my research for this case, I found that something similar happened to a captain of a Starbow ATR-72 in Ghana back in 2017. During takeoff, the captain's seat suddenly moved back while he was steering the nosewheel with a handwheel called the tiller. The sudden yank moved the nosewheel in a way that sent the aircraft off the runway and into a barbed wire fence. After the Air India Express incident, the Boeing 737 was repaired and returned back to service. I do not know if the same can be said about the pilots, as this information is kept from the public due to privacy reasons. What a strange case that luckily didn't end in disaster. And that's it for today's video. If you liked it, leave a like and consider subscribing. Also, check out my many other videos on interesting aviation incidents. I'm sure that there are some in there that you have never heard of. Thanks also very much to my Patreon supporters. Your contributions are very much appreciated. That said, thank you all for watching, and see you all in the next one.